Anyone who knows me personally knows that I am a passionate video game player. Video games are a huge part of my life and have made friendships, encouraged conversation, and given me more wonderful experiences in storytelling, character, creation, and pure fun than I could even begin to count. Though the video games industry has a long way to mature as a whole, I wholeheartedly believe that video games are a new and emerging art form akin to film or literature, and have the potential to address themes common in other storytelling mediums in new and exciting ways. If you'd like to hear more about this idea, go watch the weekly show Extra Credits on Penny Arcade TV. They've got a lot of great commentary on games as an emerging artistic medium. One thing about video games that interests me personally is thinking about the various environments, cultures, and cultural issues surrounding some video games. Any game that is not just a puzzle game must present in some form some sort of world that the player either helps shape, builds up, or functions in. Through both exposition and game mechanics, every game world has so much potential to build a setting through the manner the game creators choose, whether dictated by the developers or crafted by the players themselves. Everything from the Mushroom Kingdom in Mario, to the Kingdom of Hyrule in the Legend of Zelda series, to the randomly generated completely open plains, mountains, and deserts of Minecraft has a certain degree of backstory, background characters, and environmental quirks that make the experience unique. One of the most interesting and complex of these settings is the Warhammer 40k universe, which has been presented in a number of games. Warhammer is a tabletop role-playing game in which each player leads their accumulated armies of the various races in the universe against each other until one comes out on top. I was first exposed to the Warhammer universe through Relic Entertainment and THQ's real-time strategy game Dawn of War, particularly its second expansion, Dark Crusade. In the game, like the tabletop game, you lead an army to victory over 1, 2, 3, or even 7 other players, each with their own army and base that they slowly build up over time. I'll spare further anecdotal details because I've already padded this intro out longer than it needs to be, so I'll pose a question. How can a simple army control tactics game based on a tabletop fighting game possibly provide narrative about culture? This actually turned out to be an easier question to answer than I thought. But first, here's a little background. When I first started playing the game with my friends, one in particular was extremely proficient at the Space Marines, one of 2 human races in the game. They are a powerful force, and a fairly easy race to learn as a beginner, but can cause a lot of damage in the right hands, especially against the meatbag orc armies I used to play as. Even in the first few matches I played, I began to notice interesting banter coming from the Space Marine army.
Oh, shit, a spear the Emperor drag!
It is better to die for the Emperor than live for yourself.
Heresy grows from idleness. This is the judgment of the righteous! Scum! Redeem them with sword and fire! We strike with the wrath of the righteous!
Burn, heretic!
By the Emperor it shall be so. Today the enemy shall know freedom. The Emperor guides my blade. You go to spread his word. Only in war are we truly faithful.
Now, let's be honest. Most of it sounds like something you'd read from medieval or even biblical-era texts, much less something that supposedly takes place 38,000 years in the future, in our own galaxy with humans being descended from and far, far more advanced than us. They speak of this emperor as if he is a god, often referencing this figure in ways not unlike the Bible references God at times. How can such a technologically advanced human race sound so archaic and even regressive at times?
Suffer not for which to live.
This is far different from the technobabble of Star Trek and the like, and they often address cultural ideals quite well at that.
Highly illogical.
The answer comes from the backstory of the Warhammer 40k universe, only very little of which is detailed directly in the Dawn of War series. I became curious on the matter, and my hallmate pointed me to the Lexicanum, the Wikipedia of the Warhammer universe. I pulled up some articles, and before you know it, I was chest-deep in canon lore and backstory on all races of the series. All of this lore information preceding comes directly from the Lexicanum, and is official canon for the game, but I will warn you, I am going to summarize this stuff, sometimes very heavily, so if you would like the complete version, I recommend checking it out for yourself. So back to the question at hand. Why is this advanced race of humans so organized and advanced, yet so barbaric at times? Well, here's a kinda, maybe a little bit short version of the backstory of the Imperium of Man. Currently, in 2012 CE, we exist in the Age of Terra, of which unfortunately there isn't much information on the history of man on the Lexicanum. Terra means Earth, so presumably it means humanity's age of development locally in our solar system. An account that I'll go into detail on in a few minutes claims that during this period, humans made a race of robots that almost wiped out humans, just like what seems to have happened in the Matrix. I talk more about parallels, but unfortunately there isn't any more canonical detail on that, so I'll move on. Right around the dawn of the 18th millennium began the Dark Age of Technology, a golden age of scientific progress of humanity and the height of achievement of the human race. I know that doesn't sound very dark, but just roll with me for a second. Before this age, we could only travel through space below the speed of light. During the stellar exodus, which occurred immediately before the age of technology, we began to colonize exoplanets, but because of how far away they are, trips took multiple generations. So any colonies founded outside our solar system were isolated, and humanity found itself becoming more and more disconnected with itself. What marked the beginning of the age of technology was the discovery of the existence of the warp, a parallel dimension to real space populated purely by energy and chaos. Man built warp drives to navigate this dimension, and humanity could now travel great distances in a very short amount of time, which allowed the establishment of interplanetary trade routes and infrastructure. During this age, scientific progress was idolized, even worshipped as a god, because of the richness and prosperity that it brought the Imperium. Through the age, which lasted until the 23rd millennium, humanity spread like wildfire throughout the galaxy. We made contact with alien races, both peaceful and otherwise, and the first psychers appeared. The appearance of psychers, psychics with knowledge of and powers from the warp, and the formation of warp storms marked trouble for the Imperium. Early psychers were able to repress the demonic forces of the warp, but as they were allowed to practice and develop their powers on some planets, and persecuted as witches on others, the forces of chaos eventually corrupted them. Beginning in the 23rd millennium, these new chaos forces emerged along with the warp storms, which disrupted infrastructure and communication between the Imperium's planets and plunged some into permanent isolation. So began the Age of Strife, which lasted for 7,000 years. The warp storms made warp travel much more difficult and gave newly corrupted psychers uncontrolled power, and humanity was threatened with annihilation both from within themselves and from alien races, most notably the orcs, who took advantage of humanity's weakness and raided and plundered many human worlds. These developments caused people to look back to the Age of Technology with revilement and disgust, which led to the Golden Age of Technology becoming known instead as a Dark Age. The figure who would become known as the Emperor of Mankind officially enters human records towards the end of the Age of Strife. Not much is known about his life, but he appears first in the Imperium's records as one of the many warlords struggling for control of Terra during the later part of the Age of Strife. He emerged victorious, and he unified Terra under his own rule. He then began what is known as the Great Crusade, in a goal to unite all of humanity, all across the galaxy, under one rule, and to enlighten humanity and free it from the bonds of false gods. So began the final, current age, the Age of the Imperium. The Emperor started with the creation of the Astronomicon from his own immense psychic might. The Astronomicon is a network of guiding beacons to aid in navigation of the treacherous warp. It is through this the infrastructure was once again established and remains in form. He created 20 infants, known as the Primarchs, from his own DNA, which were meant to mature into generals in his grand army. They were lost to Chaos forces, but remained uncorrupted and were later found one by one during the Great Crusade. While they were lost, however, the Emperor used the genetic code left over from the Primarch project to create the first legion of Space Marines, which, to the present day, remains his own personal army in the liberation of humanity. As each Primarch child was found, they were put in charge of the faction of Space Marines that spawned from their genetic code. The first to be found, Horus, was instead given the title of War Master and placed on Terra to oversee military advancements in the Emperor's stead. The Emperor himself would retreat to work on the machinery within the Golden Throne, an immense structure originally built to house the Astronomicon, which it still does, and to provide access by mankind to the Eldar's webway system, which would eliminate the reliance on warp drives and astro-telepathy for space travel. It had to be abandoned, however, thanks to the Horus heresy. Horus believed that the Emperor, while in retirement within his lab, was instead perfecting his psychic abilities to ascend to godhood. This went against the main tenet of the Great Crusade mentioned earlier, to enlighten humanity and free it from the bonds of false gods, and led Horus to begin an uprising against the Emperor. He succumbed to the forces of chaos, corrupted fully half of all Space Marines in his cause, and plunged the Imperium into civil war. Daemons poured in from the Chaos Realm through the Golden Throne's webway system and proceeded to slaughter billions across the Imperium. In a final battle in orbit above Earth, the Emperor's forces led a desperate assault on Horus's flagship. The battle was only barely won with Horus slain, but the Emperor was left dying. He was placed into life support within the Golden Throne, this function which would keep his remaining cells alive for over 10,000 years. Currently, the mutilated remains of the Emperor are kept alive in the Golden Throne. The Emperor now survives purely through sheer force of will. Every thought of his is directed towards guiding and protecting his race. Physically, the Imperium's rule is held together purely through the network of beacons that make up the Astronomicon and the travel and communication that allows. The Imperium's rule is therefore far-reaching but quite fragile. As such, the Emperor is worshipped as a god figure. His psychic might is devoted entirely to protecting his race. His will is carried out through the Space Marines and the Imperial Guard, as well as Imperium-wide worship and idolization of the Emperor as a god. As the Lexicanum states, the common worship of the Emperor holds mankind together and instills loyalty towards the Imperium.
It is better to die for the Emperor than live for yourself.
So, I've just given you several minutes of backstory and background. What of it already? Well, let's break this down a bit. First, there's that short Matrix parallel I mentioned earlier. It's loose, but the battle between man and his creation is there. Second, it's unclear what happens to traditional religion during the Age of Technology, but it definitely morphs significantly. From what little detail there is, the dominant religion within mankind through these millennia eventually turns into a collective belief and praise in scientific progress and the scientific method as our God. In a way, this seems like a very logical turn of events. At the rate science is progressing today, we are learning more and more details about the physical circumstances surrounding how the universe works and how it may have begun. Over the millennia, as this progress builds up, it makes sense that the general public would abandon traditional religion, which requires faith in what cannot be seen, for one whose effects are readily clear to us. Especially after the Emperor appears and is restricted to his golden throne, humanity pours all its love and faith into the binding force that connects all humans to each other. In this case, it is a man with godlike powers, who seems to be fairly omnipotent since he discovered and actively protects humanity from the demonic forces of the warp. Although, it is entirely possible that traditional religious practices endured through the ages. All that we can see are the official, church-separate-from-state military policies and practices present in the game. To the lay people, the Emperor could have been the second coming of Christ, and his crusade could have been revelation incarnate. It's no secret that faith is important to humans.
Our faith makes us strong. Faith is purest when it is unquestioning. Faith is our shield. Faith and duty. Fear denies faith.
So it's entirely possible that the state of the Imperium and the characteristics of the Emperor are viewed by people as the playing out of biblical events. In this case, it would strengthen their faith and keep humanity bound under one rule. Third, there's a parallel with early Jesus movements and their diversity, represented by the story of the Emperor himself. He first appeared in human records at the end of the Age of Strife as a powerful warlord, but his life is shrouded in mystery. Facts about his early life are fragmented at best. The Lexicanum references a tale of 20 psychers who collectively created the Emperor all the way back in 8000 BCE. These psychers were revered as shamans in their time, and foresaw grave doom in humanity's future. Thus, they entered a suicide pact and reincarnated themselves as one new man. He lived in secret through the years, and finally emerged when humanity needed him most, at the end of the Age of Strife. This tale is only the conglomerate of many, many different retellings of the story of the Emperor's birth and early life. The Lexicanum states that little is known about the majority of the Emperor's life, of who he was and what he did before he emerged as the great Emperor of mankind. The actual story is fragmented and unknown in whole, except within the Emperor's memory. In exactly the same way, we do not know exactly what Jesus' life entailed, or even how he got his power. Was he born divine, or did God simply empty himself into him at baptism? Or is it something in between? The Emperor's story, like Jesus, is also populated with numerous retellings. There exists a cryptic account of the Emperor's origins that feels very much as if it is to the Emperor's story as the non-canonical Gospels were to the canonical ones. It was deemed heretical and kept from being published, but passed down through generations of keepers of the Library Sanctus of Terra, not unlike the secret of the Priory of Sion from the Da Vinci Code. This is the story that tells of the Iron Men who nearly wiped out humanity. It also tells that the emperors of a race of man from the Golden Age, which ended in the 21st millennium, as the Emperor prepared for mankind. The story claims that the first race of man, the Golden Race, came before humanity, which is of the Stone Race that built and fought against the Iron Men. This tale is not very detailed at all, but it clearly divides humanity into two phases, which is probably why it was deemed heretical. The collective account of the Emperor's story also involves him hiding, inactive, within the race of humans for many thousands of years before emerging and beginning the Great Crusade. Passed down in secret, just like in the Priory, this goes against the collective accepted tale, seemingly in small details, but for the Imperium of Man, for whatever reason, it strikes people as heretical and is hidden from widespread view. Fourth, and most importantly, it seems that the Emperor may in fact be a god figure incarnate. If his 8000 BCE birth date is correct, then he would be over 48,000 years old by the days of Dark Crusade. He lived in secret within humanity for 38,000 years before finally emerging, and that places him as older than even the oldest known human civilizations. Does this mean that he is in fact God incarnate? The Lexicanum cites a published account of chaos forces by claiming that the new man, once he had learned of his special nature, proceeded to haunt the history of humanity as a ghost, watching, waiting, and occasionally influencing. If the man who would live for millennia and become revered as the god of the Imperium occasionally influences throughout human history, that paints him pretty firmly as God. So, if God has been living on Earth all this time, then that seems to make humans very close to God. It invokes thoughts of the death of God theology and of the sacred becoming the profane. This happened with the death of the conclave of 20 psychers that pooled their life force into one man. The warp, the realm of the chaos, is to be populated by 4 gods by the end of the Middle Ages, and knowledge of the warp is what gives a psyker his power. The death of the psychers, then, almost perfectly reflects the death of God's situations as God emptying himself to be born as human, but takes place 8,000 years earlier, and still involves him sitting and watching over us. The level of faith of the humanity of the Imperium adds to this. The God Emperor has, discounting his comparatively short time among man as a functioning leader, merely had to watch in peace and stillness as his human race is subject to unthinkable horrors. Because the will, the Emperor, is the only thing that allows the Imperium's infrastructure to persist, his subjects preach and demand unanimous appraisal, worship, and faith in their God Emperor, so that his will can persist to protect humanity from the forces of chaos and of hostile alien races. In this way,
Faith is our shield
against despair. Only through faith to the Emperor can humanity be saved. Virtue and works alone aren't enough for the Imperium. As the Lexicanum states, the Emperor's existence is said to be an unending torment, with his every thought enslaved to the task of ruling, guiding, and protecting his race. Ultimately, it is only his will to endure that allows him to survive, as he knows his death would lead to the destruction of the Imperium and leave mankind without the guidance it needs to survive. Damn. Call me crazy, but if this wasn't pure fantasy used only as backstory for a game, I'd be moved to tears regarding all these facts that pour out of the Lexicanum regarding the Warhammer 40k universe. The parallels of this canon with real events and philosophies make it resonate even more. The fact that this kind of depth can come out of something that is only read by fanatics of the game it comes out of is a sign of a desire by the writers and creators of this game to create something meaningful, even though it's just a plaything. Earlier I mentioned that I believe that video games have the ability to do great things and explore great meaning, and this kind of thing is what I mean. It may not be directly present while playing the game, but it's there for the people who want it, and it shows that the path is set before us. It just needs to be walked down.